Hello, Grief Check. It's good to see everybody. And, we've been together for a while now. We've talked about grief in a lot of different ways. What's underneath it? What makes it tick? What is it? Who does what? How do men grieve? How do women grieve? How do children grieve? We've done a little bit on families, but we've talked about the different ways. And today, I thought we'd talk a little bit about the different manifestations of grief in different ways, how it comes out. The death of a parent, death of a child, death of a sibling, death of a child. Did I say that already? Anyway, before we get into that, I think it's important to look at the factor of disenfranchisement. I don't think we've talked about this much yet, but it's an important one to know about. Disenfranchised grief is when the culture minimizes the importance of the grief. And of course, that's most grief, because the culture minimizes the importance of most. But, there are some types of grief where the culture blesses it to a degree. The death of a child, I think the culture kind of really acknowledges that that is a traumatic kind of event. But there are some types of grief where it's not as acknowledged, and it's much, much more difficult for people. One of those areas is a fiancé. If a fiance dies, a lot of times they're left with a huge amount of grief because it's like a spouse dying, but it's not seen as being the same by the culture at large. Culture at large doesn't acknowledge that the death of a fiance is anything like the death of a spouse. So a lot of times the people who have the fiance die are left with a lot of grief, and it's disenfranchised. That is, people don't acknowledge that it's an important loss in the ways that it really is. So that's one area. Miscarriage is another one, and we'll talk about miscarriage as being what happens during that particular loss, because it's an important one. But people do not see that as being a death in the same kind of way that you think of the death of a child, death of a parent, that kind of thing, death of a spouse. So it's disenfranchised, and people don't acknowledge that it is a potent loss, and the miscarriage is a very potent loss. And I think that's one of the ones we're going to talk about today. Maybe the most important one is adoption. The trauma that people have when they're adopted is huge. And do I have a copy of that book around someplace? Darn, I don't. But it's a book called The Primal Wound. And it's a very, very potent book. And it's all about the loss that happens when someone is adopted. And there's a million little losses that go into this. But the culture doesn't really acknowledge it. The culture kind of says, oh, you've got new parents, and the new parents are wonderful, and, you can have a wonderful life now. No, no, and no. Because that initial loss of having a parent reject you at birth is potent. And it's not just potent in a psychological sense where we get to be 10 years old and we think, well, why did mom and dad reject me? Why didn't they want me? And that's bad enough. But there's something that happens physiologically after an adoption where the child, the baby, has this sense of being separated from this part of them. So it's a traumatic event that most people don't realize is there at all. A lot of the people I've seen over the years, I shouldn't say a lot, maybe 20% of the people I've seen for grief, adoption has been a part of it. Because that adoption loss is huge. And very few people recognize it. Very few people say, oh, this is a trauma and this is something that needs to be worked on. No, no, no. In fact, there are a lot of times, like I said, that they say, oh, you have these wonderful parents who love you so. And it's true. They do have these wonderful parents who love them so. But it doesn't really help the original trauma of being ripped away from your original parents. So the adoption thing is critical. And the book that I talked about, Primal Wound, let's see if I can find that book. I thought I'd pull that thing out. Oh, poo. Anyway, it's got a purple cover. You can't miss it. But it's called Primal Wound, and it really goes into detail about what really happens to little kids when they're adopted. And be careful in recommending this book. I would suggest you read it first because it's a blockbuster and it doesn't pull punches and it's very, very potent. About half the people who read this book uh, are upset with it. The other half are like, wow, where's this book been? So this is one you want to be a little bit careful with and read it first, and you'll get an idea of what you're going to suggest to people. Because I always tell people before I recommend this book that this is a very potent book, and if after the first 2 or 3 pages you're reading it that it's too much, put it down. Put it down, because sometimes people aren't aware of the losses that go on in their own adoption, and it's a very potent loss that most people uh, tend to diminish because they got these wonderful parents, which they do. They got these wonderful parents, and they love their adoptive parents, and the adoptive parents love them. But you see, that's not it's not helping this original loss. Anyway, so that's disenfranchised grief. The different types of grief that are disenfranchised, and people don't really appreciate that kind of potency of the grief that people have. Okay, let's talk about the different types of grief. How about starting with the death of a child? That one's just so incredibly potent, so very, very difficult. And it's one that we need to know about and think about a little bit because it stops people's world. It's just a world changer. There's a story about a Buddhist monk who wrote a poem for a king. And the poem went like this: May your son die, may his son die, may his son die, and may his son die. The king was furious. Why are you talking about the death of all of my children? And he's going to chop off the monk's head. The monk, luckily, said, wait a minute, king, hold on. This is a blessing that the generations die in order. When the generations die in order, it's a blessing to people. It's something that people don't recognize as being a blessing, but it is. And you realize how much of a blessing it is when you have a child die. That just completely turns everything upside down. Because parents want to raise their children so that they'll survive as the parents die. When that gets reversed, it throws people into an absolute tailspin. Throws people into chaos, huge chaos. It's disorienting. The parents I've worked with over the years, it's so disorienting that they need to find something to hold on to. And one of the things you can do for people who've experienced the death of a child is make sure you get them to Compassionate Friends. Compassionate Friends is an organization for people who've experienced the death of a child. And it's a great organization. And there is no substitute for parents being around other parents who have had a child die. These people bond like glue. It's just so quickly that they bond together. And they need that. They need other people who've experienced the same loss. When they have you and me, that's a good thing. And we can kind of give them a certain amount of stability. We can give them a certain amount of being able to hear their story, which is exactly what they need to do. They need to tell that story over and over and over again, just like all grief. But we're not enough. Parents really need to have other parents who've experienced the same thing. And the bonding that I've seen over the years with parents that connect with others is just phenomenal. And it really, really helps them over time. The other thing that happens sometimes with the death of a child is the child's friends will become very close with the parents of the child who died. And I've seen some really beautiful friendships of parents and children. The children these are usually teenagers, will come like once a week or once for dinner or whatever. And just having that child around is so affirming for the adults. It gives them some sense of peace. And they also realize that these kids, all the friends of their child who died, are extremely upset also. So it's important that we help people connect with others who have had the same loss. And the death of a child is just a mammoth example of that, where we need to make sure that they have some sort of connection with other people who have had the same kind of loss because it's so disorienting. Your world literally turns upside down. Nothing makes sense anymore. And my computer just went out. Come back. Will you please come back? The death of a child is also the place where you see friction between men and women because they're so wiped out and so disoriented, and they automatically go back to their base. And for the woman, the base oftentimes, not always, of course, we've learned that some women are more like men, some men are more like women, but oftentimes the women will move towards the tend and befriend mode where they talk, they connect with other people. The men will tend to move towards the action mode where they are doing something in honor of. So I don't know if I've told you the story before about the man I worked with who wrote a book about his son. And it wasn't a book to publish with Random House or whoever. It was a book that he used basically to tell the story of his son. He went around to all his teachers and the son's teachers and the son's girlfriends and ex-girlfriends and interviewed them all. In each interview, he'd make a little chapter of the book. So he was telling the story of his son. He was chronicling the story of his son in this little book. The same thing someone would do in a support group, but he was doing it with the book. Well, anyway, the mom didn't really understand the dad's obsession with this book, and she thought he should be talking about his feelings more. And the dad thought she was nuts for telling him so. And that's the kind of conflict you'll see in relationship when a man and a woman have a child die. Because they're so down to the bone with this grief that they revert back to an earlier stage, actually. And of course, grief pulls us all back a little bit. It pulls us all back to an earlier stage. But not only that, but they are moving back to their natural form of grieving. And when they see the other one not doing it like they do, they get upset. So keep an eye peeled for that kind of thing with parents who have experienced the death of a child. Oh gosh, what else? That's about it for the child thing. Compassionate friends. Keep that one in mind. Death of a spouse. The death of a spouse, like with all grief, if it's a sudden, unexpected death, it's going to take more time. It's going to be more difficult. Same thing with the death of a child. If a child dies suddenly and unexpectedly, there's no chance to say goodbye. There's no chance to tell that story. There's no chance to interchange love. And so just boom, out of no place something happens. The grief's going to get longer and longer. So with the death of a spouse, what happens with spouses, when their spouse dies? And I've seen it over and over and over again with the spouses I've worked with. What they tell me is, what's the worst thing about this for you? They say the same thing. The worst thing about this is I no longer have that one person who knows my story. Think about it. Parents come home and they talk about the day, and just saying, well, Jim did such and such, and she knows the whole story about Jim. She knows everything that's going on, so he doesn't have to explain anything. She knows the whole story. This is a blessing. It's a blessing that oftentimes people don't appreciate when they have it. When I was working at St. Francis back years and years ago, and I heard this from the spouses whose spouse died, started making me really appreciate at home my wife and how she knew my story, and how I knew hers. So that's a critical piece with spouses. They tend to be the one person who knows exactly what's going on. And that's a blessing you usually don't know it's a blessing until you lose it. What else about spouses? Oh boy, the issue of when to date again. Wow. That is a nuclear kind of thing. And what happens is, the men tend to want to date more quickly after their spouse dies. And it freaks out the people around them. Oftentimes the men will start dating just a couple of months after a death. And it leaves everyone, what the hell is going on? Why is he doing that? And they did some research on this, and it's a fascinating piece. The research says that men will tend to want to re-up a relationship more quickly after the death of a spouse for two reasons. One reason is to deny the death. Of course, that's not a good thing. We want to try and keep an eye peeled for that. But a larger percentage of men do this because their wife had provided their sole social output. Women have this tendon friend thing where they have people all over the place they talk to all the time. Men do not have that. Most men depend on their wives as their sole source of support. Because of that, when a wife dies, a man's not only crushed to missing the person who knew his story, he's not only crushed from having his wife die, he's crushed from now being cut back on all of his friends. Because after a spouse dies, you see what happens so many times is the social group say, oh no, you're a single person now. You don't fit anymore. And so both spouses are cut out from their connections with other couples because they went and did things as couples and now they're not couples anymore. So it's difficult for both men and women. It's a little bit harder for men because their entire social life was dependent upon their connection with their wife, whereas the wife probably has some good girlfriends and others who she would go out and do things with and this and that and the other, and the man was solely dependent just on the wife for that. So that's something to keep in mind with that. What else with the death of a spouse? Knowing the story, when to date again. Oh, the families get upset. Oh my gosh, when the dads start dating again after a couple of months, 3 months, 4 months, the kids get upset. And I'm talking about older kids now, not just the younger kids. Of course, the younger kids would get upset, but usually the dads don't start dating again if they've got, young kids around. They're too focused on making sure the kids are taken care of. But when the kids are older and the dad gets out and starts thinking, well, maybe I should date, the kids get upset. How can you do this? Didn't you love mom? And he's thinking, wait a minute. Yes, I loved her, but she's not here. See, he's a bit more detached probably than the mom. But you'll see that. The kids are going to get yanked about all this. And the family trouble that happens is mammoth. Over the years, I've seen a lot of families. What we do, bring everybody in and have a session and talk about it. And give everybody a chance to talk about what's going on. And hopefully by the end of that session, the kids know a little bit more about what dad is up to. Because so many times when dad is finding another person to be with for social reasons, the person he finds is, ready for this, someone who's helping him with his grief. I had a guy the other day, the family was all upset about him, not starting to date again until we had the meeting. And he started talking about a couple of things. One was talking with this girlfriend about his wife, because actually the girlfriend was a friend of his wife. And the kids started changing their attitude a little bit, a tiny bit, because they realized that he was really working with his grief a little bit. And he started talking about things he did at home, the place to honor his wife. And they started realizing dad is grieving for mom. And that's important for kids to know. Dad is grieving for mom. He's not just forgetting her, because that's what the kids feel like. They feel like he's just forgetting her. And here's the deal. The kids have the death of their mother they're dealing with, right? But if their father starts dating somebody else, guess what? Now their father is dying to them and their family is dying to them. Because if dad's got a woman who's living in their house, their old house, it feels awful funny for them. They can't come into the house and grieve in the same way they would if the woman was not there. You see how it works? And it's a tricky business. It's a tricky business. And but you'll see that. You'll see that with spouses. Okay. What else? The death of a parent. The death of a parent at an early age is something you'll see quite a bit, because that's a very difficult. In fact, that's kind of a disenfranchised death, because people don't acknowledge the potency of that loss. Boy, it is potent, though. There's a great book called The Loss That Lives Forever by Maxine Harris. And it is a great book on this very topic. What happens to people when their parents die when they're young. And Maxine goes into this. She interviews, I think, like 40 people who've had this experience. And by the end of the book, you're like, oh my gosh, because she's tying everything together. And you're seeing these trends in all these people as adults, that they're acting in certain ways that's directly connected to their death of their parent at an early age. So that's a potent one to keep in mind, that it's a very difficult loss and somewhat disenfranchised and hidden, because, as kids, they don't have the skills really to grieve for a parent who's died. It throws in too much chaos because kids depend on parents as their rock. Oh, this is my rock to sit on. It's my rock that holds things down, that gives me control, gives me a sense of stability. And in fact, the little kids think of mom and dad as God and goddess, right? They're the rulers of the world. And when a god or goddess dies, what a mess. It's a huge mess. So it's a very difficult loss. The Loss That Lives Forever. I would highly recommend you read that just for your own benefit, because it's quite a book and helps understand the dynamics of what happens to people when their parents die when they're very young. Okay. And then there's what we're going to do. When parents die at a later age, it's not so much of a trauma. People usually have their own families and their parents die, and it almost feels like it's the right thing. There's this schedule that goes on, like your son dies, his son dies, his son dies. It's the same kind of thing. It's the loss is somewhat more expected and natural, when a parent is older. Okay, what else? Let's see, what have we not done? Parent, spouse, death of a child. Of course, the time limits on grief is another thing. That people tend to think that grief should be finished pretty quick. And of course, the research says very clearly that 6 to 9 month time is the worst. That's just the worst. And they are thinking that the reason it's the worst is because what am I thinking? The 6 to 9 months is hardest because that's the time when most people who were supporting start to, oh yeah, they're probably okay by now, And so the supports drop off, and at the same time, the denial is also dropping off. So the pain gets more difficult, more present at the same time that their supports go down and kadoomy. They get hit with this 6 to 9 month place where it's very difficult. Of course, then again, the year anniversary is tough. And in deaths where there is where it's sudden and unexpected, the second year sometimes is worse than the first year. It's very, very difficult that second year, and people just scratch their heads and say, what is going on with this? It's been a year. And people around them go, well, aren't you over that yet? It's been a year, right? But really, it's because that first year was taken up with trying to figure out what the heck just hit them. They're in chaos. It takes a while to put together the idea that person had died, And so after they get this idea together in the first year, whammo, that second year, the grief comes up in a very different kind of way that's more potent. And it freaks people out. A lot of times you'll get people coming in to see you, that second year, and they say, there's something wrong with me, And what we need to do over and over and over again with people is to normalize this stuff and tell them, hey, nothing wrong with you. This is what you're going through. This is what a lot of people go through, because it's a sudden, unexpected death. It's going to take longer. And that second year sometimes is tougher than the first one. I'm telling you, when I tell people that, I can see their faces. Oh, they're relieved because they really think they're going nuts. Because this grief stuff is very difficult, and it can feel like you're going nuts sometimes. Yeah, the whole thing with time limits on grief is crazy, because grief doesn't stop. It sticks with us and it kind of orbits around us, you know? And that orbit goes farther out. So it's no longer impinging on us. It's no longer kind of present minute by minute. But it's still there. It's still there. Yeah, what else did we want to talk about? Anything else? Maybe that's enough for now. We're going to talk about the death of a sibling, I guess. We should say a couple words about that. Because it's a very different experience, the death of a sibling. And that's another one, actually, that is so many times is disenfranchised, But the sibling death is tough. It's tough, particularly at an early age, because we don't have the skills to deal with things. And when you lose your siblings, you kind of lose your family, you lose your past. Those are the people who know what it was like growing up when you were growing up. They're, even if you don't get along that well, they still know. They know your story. They knew what you were like. They knew what other people thought of you. They knew the crap you pulled when you were little, And it's this connection that gets lost. And a part of us dies because that sibling died. Anyway, that's probably enough for now. So if you have questions about any of this stuff, we can talk about it at the webinar, and we'll go into it in more detail. But I think that's enough for now about the different kinds of grief and the different ways it manifests. So we'll see you.